Okay, Brain Room, episode 2 here. Sorry, I'm just looking at my email on my phone. This is actually a second take. The first take I did, I started to, I had to get up and let the cat out of my room, and, I figured I would just start over because it was getting a little unfocused. So, I kind of got this spur of the moment idea to talk about one of my favorite composers, some of my favorite music of all time, which is the late, and by late I mean from 1975 roughly to the end of his life, music of Morton Feldman. So this is 1975 to 1987, thereabout. This music is pretty notorious. Sorry, I dropped my glasses under my chair. I don't really need them. His music is pretty notorious for being long, being quiet, being really abstract, and really being unapproachable in many ways, not just as a listener, but as an analyst. And there are virtually no real analytic papers or video content. There's tons of YouTube content about music analysis now. You can't really throw a rock without hitting some really stupid, music page that's like, oh yeah, look at me, I'm talking about, check out 12-tone music. This is Schoenberg. That was not a call out of the channel 12-tone. 12-tone's a fine channel. All of those channels are fine. They're all fine. I've watched all of them. Adam Neely, they're fine. They serve a purpose. I don't think they're aimed at people like me, but they serve a purpose. Anyway, so Feldman's music is an enigma. I when first I heard his music, I hated it. Capital H, hated it. I thought it was pretentious. I thought it was annoying. I felt insulted by, the audacity of like, oh yeah, I'm going to write a piece that's 6 hours long and, is really dissonant and quiet. It's like, it offended my sensibilities for one reason or another. And of course I was like 19, 20 years old at the time. I was still young. I'm still young, but I was even younger. And so I'm not really sure what happened, but I guess I have a tendency to want to investigate these sort of negative reactions I have to things and educate myself about them more. And over time, after listening to a few pieces, particularly violin and string quartet and Coptic Light, and then ultimately Triadic Memories and some of the other stuff, I fell deeply in love with Feldman's music still to this day. I think some of this was a time thing because, sorry, I thought I heard someone outside my door. Some of this was a time thing, and timing thing, because it was winter. It was a kind of a particularly cool winter where I was. I was in South Carolina at the time, visiting family, listening to a lot of this stuff. And it was cold and rainy, and it was gray all the time. And, we live on a pond, so there was mist and fog coming off the pond. And I found myself just wanting to listen endlessly to Triadic Memories, Patterns in a Chromatic Field, String Quartet 2, all this stuff. And, I listened to a lot of these pieces several times at this point. String Quartet 2 I've listened to once. The version I like is the Ives Quartet version, which is it's about 5 hours. It's kind of short actually, but I really like that version. Maybe it's because it's the first I heard, but I don't know. I think I think their string sound is really warm compared to the Flux Quartet version, which is more which I've heard parts and bits and pieces of. I think it's more, their version is, the Flux Quartet version is a little more like nebulous and floaty and kind of eerie. So, they have their strengths and weaknesses. Anyway, fell in love with his music. And still, to me, some of the most important music to me as a composer and as a writer. Of course, if you listen to my rock music, you probably won't hear any influence from Morton Feldman in an overt way. But I think a lot of his philosophies about writing and the way he approached sort of the staff paper as his canvas really spoke to me at the time, and I think in many ways something I still think about even if I'm writing some of that music. And so I'm in a class now for my graduate courses, called Seminar on Music After 1900. And one of the assignments is to write a short research paper about, a topic, a specific piece of music. And I knew I wanted to write about Feldman because Feldman is pretty much my favorite of the 20th century composers. I think his work, it's kind of ironic in that sense, because if you think about the 20th century, to me, I think of the 20th century as being an accelerationism of technique and rigor. It's like if you think about Schoenberg, that takes, romantic music to this new level of technique and rigor, where you have 12-tone music, and you're very specific about, having a row and having it deployed in certain ways, and doing, all this stuff with what is now, I guess, called set theory and all that stuff. And the music of Webern and Schoenberg and that stuff I love. I also like Stravinsky a lot. I like a lot of the neoclassical stuff. I mean, it's all pretty cool. I'm not as big a fan of the sort of post World War II, European stuff like Boulez. I appreciate that music. I respect it greatly, but I just can't listen to it. It sounds like a good thought experiment, but it doesn't really pay dividends in the listening department. Maybe in a live performance setting it would be different, but in the context of, listening to music on Spotify or on YouTube, it doesn't really communicate, I think, well to me. And I love Feldman's music because I think after the arc of that time, and John Cage too, I really love John Cage. I think after that arc of, art music is more and more about the process, about the rigor of composition, about, composition is now about using technique as opposed to anything else. I think, to me, to go in the opposite direction and say, I'm writing very subjectively, and just going my own way is a very, very powerful thing to have done at that time. And I think the New York school maybe doesn't get enough credit for that, because I think that engendered a new way of looking about an alternate perspective that I think academic music hasn't really caught to yet. When I was in undergraduate school, my music schooling was more traditional in the sense it was, I wasn't focusing on jazz like I am now. It was more like an all around, typical, you have your classical theory, oral skills, and you might learn a little bit about modern techniques. But really, I mean, when you learn about that stuff, it's really just, you just talk about 12-tone music and set theory, and that really only takes you up to 70 years ago, 60 years ago. Like, there's been so much music since that those techniques are almost irrelevant at this point. And more and more time passes, and it's like the academic side of things hasn't really presented anything new, any new theories. And I don't think there are any new theories, because I think we're in a postmodern world where narrative and theory is a thing of the past. But whatever. Without getting into that stuff, this paper, specifically this paper I'm doing about Feldman, is about how his sort of idiosyncratic ways of notating his music in his late works correlates to the music itself, to create a visual image with sound. The title of the paper is, let me pull it up, is How It Looks is How It Sounds, a visual and musical analysis of Morton Feldman's piano and string quartet, which I'll probably end up changing that title to something a little bit more elegant, but that was sort of that's like my third or fourth title. I find myself changing the title a lot in these research papers, which I do like to write. I actually do enjoy writing research papers. I think it allows me to kind of flex my brain muscles a little bit. Anywho, So one thing that I've observed in looking at Feldman's scores, and this is something that people say kind of implicitly, but has never really been explicitly explained. The closest I've seen is there's a great video that Samuel Andreev did a few years ago where he talks about the piece bass, clarinet, and percussion, where he talks about that piece's sort of grid format. So to summarize his point briefly is that in bass, clarinet, and percussion you have two lines. You have the bass clarinet line and the percussion line. The bass clarinet line has changing time signatures every bar, and the percussion line stays in 3/4 the whole time. These two lines are not really meant to line up or intersect until you get to a certain point. And so you have this period of sort of metric dissonance that happens for, it's basically like three systems of music with, I think it's like three systems of music with 9 bars per line or something like that. You should go watch the video because he explains it a lot better than I could. And eventually at the end of this pattern, at the end of this sequence, it syncs up again at the first beat of the next one. So you get all the way, like basically all of the beats of each of these individual measures eventually lines up to the 3/4 measure again after a certain period of time, which is pretty crazy. And that's something that you see it, but you don't really hear it necessarily. And I think this element of this element of composing the score as an artwork, as a piece of visual art, and composing the piece as a piece of music are this dichotomy is something that exists in his other works at this time, and I don't know if it's something that people allude to, but I don't think has ever been explicitly stated. Another thing that's often alluded to that I discuss a little bit is the relationship of this stuff to graph notation, which Feldman was a proponent of early in his career, but he eventually abandoned. But he never totally abandoned the grid, because you can still find the grid in these pieces. Like I just said, in bass, clarinet, and percussion, that piece uses a grid in a kind of loose way. And same thing with the piano and string quartet. Piano and string quartet, if you look at the score, it looks... First of all, the score that's published, or at least the copy that I have, is a facsimile of his handwriting, and it's very elegant. It's very it's handwritten. His handwriting has its own kind of interesting things about it. But so it's 9 bars per line per system. Each system is 5 stabs. So you have one stab for the piano. You don't have a grand staff. You just have one single line that alternates bass, clef, and treble as needed. And then you have first violin, second violin, viola, cello. Then you have a line in between each so that everything fits. You have 3 systems on one page, 9 bars each, which is kind of just an arbitrary thing, He does that a lot. If you look at a lot of his pieces from this period, you'll have these 9 bar per line things, and it's very meticulous. I think he wanted his scores to look good, is essentially what I'm saying. But another thing that's striking about the score is that if you look at it, none of the bars of rests are notated. This is something that's common too in some of his other pieces, is that he'll just leave bars blank to signify a rest, which is a musical thing, but a visual thing too. Like, I mean, was there anything really stopping him from writing a rest there? Not necessarily. But is there anything stopping him from not writing a rest there? Not necessarily as well. That's an artistic choice from a visual perspective that communicates itself in an interesting way musically. Because another thing about the way Feldman writes is that he uses these, he uses time signatures, or he uses meter, not in a rhythmic way, not in a way to like set up a rhythmic template with which he sort of elaborates his musical ideas with, but the meter communicates duration almost. So note lengths, rest lengths, phrase lengths are communicated through these changing meters. There's an example in the score on page 14 of a sort of a chordal shape that the strings play that comes up a few times and is changed. So the first time it comes up is you have 2 bars of 2/2 time, with the strings playing long notes that extend through both bars, and then you have a bar of rest, which is signified with the 3/8 bar the first time. That phrase repeats a second time with a 5/8 bar as the rest. So now you're elongating the time between iterations of this idea. On the third repetition of this, he does it 3 times. He does it 3 times, and so it fits. He fits this entire phrase onto the 9-bar staff, and so it goes 3/5/7. He adds 2 eighth notes to each one, subtly lengthening the time between it, which I think is interesting. The next time this thing comes up, which is on the next page halfway down, after being interrupted kind of by a completely different idea, he puts the 3/8 bar in the middle of the phrase, making the note longer as opposed to the rest. So you have the 2/2 bar essentially broken up with this bar that was originally a rest, but is now elongated note. So he uses time signatures to affect duration, which, duration is a big part of Feldman's music, because he just chose at this point to write long pieces. I mean, pieces of an hour's length are not necessarily uncommon, but pieces of 3 hours length or 4 or 5 or 6, in the case of some of his works, I mean, those are pretty extreme. There's not a lot of those, especially at this time. I can drink my coffee. I gotta stop drinking coffee in the afternoon. Maybe that's why I don't get any sleep. But anyway, so this thing I'm getting at is essentially the thesis is that Feldman was painting with sound in a way by, making these elaborate scores that have a very artisan quality to them. And of course, because I'm still fleshing this idea out. The paper, I'll probably have to do a revision of it after I turn it in, because it'll be a little, it'll be on the rough side. But I think, this approach, which is not necessarily a rigorous method, like you can't really teach this method. You can't just say, oh yeah, just do what you want, just make something that looks good on paper. I think it provides the young composer, me in this instance, with an alternative way of approaching composition by being very subjective, which is something that I think has been almost antithetical to Western music for the last several hundred years, or at least not totally antithetical. I would say Mozart and Beethoven wrote their music in a very kind of subjective way. Like, they wrote their music. I think you could argue that a lot of the rules that we have about theory, even though some of them were codified at the time, are in some ways post hoc rationalizations of the music that was being written then. And this is just something that is pretty common throughout music history. Like, if you look at this is getting a little far afield, but I'll bring it back around. If you look at jazz, I always bring it to jazz. People get mad at me, but I always bring it to jazz, because jazz is art music to me. It's just improvised art music. But if you look at jazz, there was no codification of jazz in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s. So there were no real rules for bebop. Guys just played like Charlie Parker. They listened to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie play. They copied them. And eventually, because you're supposed to be creative as a composer, improviser, musician, the goal is to replicate that stuff in an organic way that becomes authentic to yourself. And then, of course, you get in the 60s, eventually, late 60s, early 70s, people start to codify this stuff. And I'll have to do a video about this at some point, but boy, did jazz theory get it all wrong. And when I say get it all wrong, I mean just about all of it. Pretty much everything you learn about jazz theory is wrong. I hate to say, at least when it comes to improvising. I think, especially when it comes to improvising bebop, because if anybody tries to tell you ever on D minor 7 you play D Dorian, on G minor 7, on G7 you play G Mixolydian, on C major you play C Ionian, pay them no mind, because they have a bridge to sell you, essentially. But that's another. I'll get into that in another video at some point in the future. So to bring this back to Feldman, I think there's something about his music that's very. I think maybe I can't remember if I said this in this take or the previous one, but there's something about his music that I think is really kind of sensual and sensitive, even if it is very abstract. I think he was trying to express beauty in his music the same way that someone like Beethoven or Schubert was, but through the lens of, modernist, dissonant sonorities, and relate it through, sort of like the abstract expressionist painting that he was into, Jackson Pollock, Philip Guston, Willem de Kooning, that stuff, those are wonderful artists, painters. One day I'll have some of their art up on the wall, but I'm broke, so whatever. I need to get some art in here. The walls are barren, other than these speaker panels or these foam acoustic panels. I'm really not good at interior decorating, as you can see, but yeah. So the thing about I'm doing this paper on piano and string quartet, and my goal with it is to try and try to meet the piece on its own terms, like I said, and show what he's doing just kind of on its own merit. Say, okay, he uses his time signature thing as a way of elongating the pulse, as opposed to defining the pulse and where the pulse is. It's simply elongating a phrase. And then, of course, he uses very little rhythmic material in this piece, which is kind of a departure. His previous, sort of his late 70s, early 80s pieces. See, this is where it kind of gets hairy, because even this late period quote has sub-periods. But this late 70s, early 80s period, right before Piano and String Quartet, which was 85, from basically like 78 to 84 or 83, with String Quartet 2 kind of being the culmination, he did a lot of pattern-based music, which is like kind of analogous to minimalist, but I wouldn't classify Feldman as minimalist. I would almost call his music maximalist in a way, because there's actually a lot going on in it. It's very complex music that renders itself in a very simplistic way, and kind of obscures itself in its own complexity through sleight of hand. But Piano and String Quartet does away with a lot of this patternistic writing. Instead, he writes a lot of long note durations. Occasionally, the piano might play a scale or something, or a chord or an arpeggio briefly, but it never feels rhythmic. It never feels like it's going any place necessarily. It just feels like it's floating. And a lot of his late pieces are like this. Like his final piece, piano, violin, violoncello, I think is what it's called, is really, really, really floaty, really spacey. And I think this is a very unique period of his music, and this music is very singular. There's nothing that sounds like it. So essentially, my thing here is to try and explain it on its own terms, I guess, in this paper, and say, no, this music doesn't conform to a traditional process, and there might not be a process to it to begin with, but this sort of concept of the musical score being an art that expresses sound is something that shouldn't be ignored by the young composer. I wrote the conclusion for this thing, like a little paragraph, and I think it sounds pretty smart, so I'm going to read it. Though traditional analysis of the music of Morton Feldman is perhaps a futile endeavor, as our traditional frames for analyzing music fall apart when applied to his works. When taken on their own merits and viewed not through the lens of compositional rigor and technique, but the lens of artisanal integrity and individualistic craft, Feldman's method, or lack thereof, offers the young composer an alternative perspective. This perspective of composition being a visual act as much as it is a musical one, opens the doors to expression and experimentation that other schools do not offer. And that is something, as I said, that you can't teach, unfortunately. But I think if you, like anything else, if you listen to Feldman's music and you observe it, you can kind of suss out his approaches by way of sort of deductive reasoning. But of course, if you look to Feldman himself, I've read this book, Give My Regards to 8th Street, which you should definitely read if you're interested at all in his music. I will say a lot of it is I won't say incomprehensible, but contradictory. He tends to. I find that sometimes he'll say something that conflicts with something else he said before. I can't think of any specific ideas off the top of my head. It's been a long time since I really dug into this thing, but that's sort of my impression of it. I think the guy was just, full of ideas, and I think he was always trying to find something new. At least something new that he liked, or something new that really appealed to him. But he didn't want to go through sort of the modern rigor of serialism or anything like that, because he hated that stuff. He and Boulez did not get along. I mean, and I don't think they were destined to. Both of them have kind of they both had pretty big personalities, as famous composers tend to. Feldman was a very boisterous individual, a very larger than life personality, and Boulez was very conservative, I would say, very very rigorous, very kind of my way or the highway kind of guy. Yeah, let's see. Many more thoughts about Morton Feldman. As far as favorite pieces, I do tend, for me, things start getting good around Rothko Chapel. I think that's a pretty common thought. Things start getting good in his sort of output around Rothko Chapel, and then sort of the late 70s pieces are interesting. Then once you get to the first string quartet, I think for me that's where things start really taking off. Neither, that's a good one. Piano is a good piece. These are like 77. First string quartet's 78 or 9, I think. But Triadic Memories, the second string quartet, and the second string quartet is, I think you got to listen to that one. I think everyone should listen to that one. I mean, I know not everybody has 5 hours of their life that they can just give up to a piece of music they might not be interested in, but that sure is a good one. And I think his music led me to contemplate duration and the feeling of stasis in music. Because after getting into his music, a couple years later, so like this year, I started getting into ambient music. And even though ambient music is kind of like, I wouldn't say necessarily related, they are kind of analogous to each other, Feldman's music and ambient music, because they both, at least some of the stuff I like Stars of the Lid, some of Brian Eno's work, a lot of that stuff is about, it's a certain stasis that music has, and it kind of, especially because a lot of the ambient music is very long, it's music that really takes you out of the present in a way, or maybe it really cements you in the present. I don't know. This is something I'll have to think a little bit more about and do another video on, because it's something I think about a lot, but maybe right now I don't have the words to express my exact thoughts on it. But yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about that right now. Check if you're not familiar with Feldman. Check out Triadic Memories and Patterns in a Chromatic Field, and honestly, bass clarinet and percussion is a good kind of intro piece because it's very short. Yeah, I mean, really, just listen to anything after 1980 is just perfect. I haven't listened to For Philip Guston yet. That one's a little long. It's a little long and a little wandering. I feel like String Quartet 2 is long, but it doesn't wander. I almost feel like there is like an arc to it. It feels like it's going somewhere when I listen to it. I guess I can talk briefly about that piece. So, String Quartet 2 is interesting because in Feldman's, he wrote a little program note for it, I guess, which you can find in 8th Street, where he describes the pieces like two pieces kind of working against each other. One which is about sort of being continuousness, and the other one repetition, and then consonant versus dissonance, which I think is interesting because you can kind of hear it in the piece. For me, the piece is, the first, I don't know how long exactly, but like the first hour and a half, 2 hours really builds. And around, I guess, the 3 hour mark, I don't have an exact, I guess if I look at the, Spotify version, which is the Ives Ensemble version. So like the first disc and the second disc, which is 7 tracks, around the 7th track, I think, or maybe it's the 5th or 6th track, around sort of around that middle point there, the piece reaches a real peak. Like there's a point where it goes from having been really quiet throughout the whole and very, very soft and really pensive to being very brash, and it gets really loud all of a sudden. He's got these really dissonant chords, and then for the rest of the piece it kind of fades away, and it almost feels like there's something going on there, and it almost feels like you have this really sharp exponential build-up and then a slow withering away for the remaining 3.5 hours or so of it. And it's a great piece of music. I think everybody should endeavor to listen to it. If you don't like it, that's cool. I didn't like it at first, like I said. I just hated his music the first time I heard it, but now I'm in love with it. So anyway, I think that's where I'm going to wrap up. This is Brain Room signing off. Maybe the next time I'll have a better camera or something, or maybe I'll shoot it with my phone or something. But for now, this is where we are. So thanks for watching, everybody.